mathematics and what you've done recently.
Sure. I'm a professor in the Department of Mathematics. I've been at Michigan State University since 1965. I've taken leaves from Michigan State to do other kinds of things. I worked as a program officer at the National Science Foundation for 2 years, running the teacher preparation program at the National Foundation. I'm also currently president-elect of NCTM, and I serve on a number of boards in Washington that are policy boards. I serve on the National Board for Research Priorities and Policy, and I serve on the Mathematical Sciences Education Board, and I also serve on the advisory board for the National Science Foundation, Education and Human Resources. Do you want me to say a bit about my my own professional interest?
Yes, that would be very nice.
Okay. When I came to Michigan State and took a job in the Department of Mathematics, I was really the first hire in mathematics that had an interest in the teaching and learning of mathematics. So throughout my entire career here, my own professional work has been trying to get smarter about children engaging in learning mathematics, and in particular how to help teachers structure a classroom, choose mathematical materials, ask the kinds of questions that allow students to engage in mathematics in a way that leads to deep understanding. So I've sort of had a lifelong commitment to both teachers and to student learning of mathematics.
I assume with that interest, that's what initially got you involved in looking at the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics standards, curriculum standards, and development of those. You played a key role in those. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. A group of us here at Michigan State 2.5 decades ago looked at the entire K through 12 area and looked for a place at which we thought we would be able to make the greatest difference in the lives of children. And all the research at that time and our own looking at things suggested that the middle school was a particular key. That if we could keep young people really interested in and engaged in mathematics over the middle years, that we had a chance of sending them into high school with a commitment to continue to study mathematics. And since we all believe that mathematics is a gate to so many different careers in this world, we decided that we would focus our time and energy on the middle school level. So we started working with teachers, we started running research projects and trying to understand student learning at that grade level. And we did a number of research projects that were actually focusing on teachers. Because we had been focusing at the middle school level and had begun to be noticed, in a sense, the work that we were doing here, John Dossey, who was the president of NCTM, at the time that the council decided that they were going to take a stand to write a set of standards that would be helpful to school districts in examining their own programs. And he called and asked if I would be involved in the curriculum standards, and I agreed to do that. It turned out to be some of the hardest work I've ever done in my life, but some of the most rewarding.
Why was it deemed necessary to change the vision of what mathematics should be for students?
At the time that we began this, we were already talking about technology, an information age. We had a lot of research from cognitive science about human learning. We'd found out within the mathematics education research community a lot of things about students and their engagement with mathematics. So the combination of knowing more about human learning, the combination of new mathematics being invented all the time, very different demands in our modern world about mathematics in society. Even reading a newspaper placed a different kind of intellectual demand on citizens to even understand, because there was so much data being thrown at us. So the feeling was that we absolutely had to do something that would give a vision that would help guide states, districts, local school districts and local school buildings, groups of teachers, to examine what they were doing in mathematics and have some sort of overall goal in very large statements to shoot for. It was never meant to be something that would tell a teacher what to do on a day-to-day basis. It was never meant to be a set of standards that would specify what a school district had to do. It was meant to be a set of standards that would be something that we could all rally behind and say, yes, these 13 statements at the middle school level summarize the important mathematics that students need to have an opportunity to learn. So when we wrote the standards, we were doing it again as a voice of teachers in this country through the National Council. We were trying to write down what all of us had been trying to do for a good decade before we did the standards.
Many people have questioned that the new standards have changed the vision of mathematics from a traditional view of mathematics, yet people feel that traditional mathematics was working just fine before these were brought in. Is that the case, or why did we make that change?
We have, if you look back over the last 50 years in this country, we had an era in the 50s and 60s when the concentration was on trying to get mathematics more in the minds of students and parents in this country. So we had what's now referred to as the new math era. There was a backlash to the new math era, and we had a decade of the 70s in which we went back to the basics, to direct instruction, to students memorizing basic facts, teaching of algorithms. Very few words were in mathematics texts. There was no real push on the part of the profession to engage students in understanding how mathematics is useful. During that period of time, if you look at what happened to any measures you want to look at, whether we're talking about state results, whether we're talking about standardized tests, whether we're talking about National Assessment of Educational Progress, the SAT scores, there was a significant decline in performance in this country. At the end of the decade of the 70s, the National Council wrote an agenda for action in which the council was saying, this is not what our students need to be able to work and live in a modern world. And so we started working on trying to raise the mathematical vision to one that included, and please hear me, one that included students being skillful at basic facts, students being skillful at many of the things that are the heart and soul of mathematics. But the push was to bring things into balance is the best way that I can describe it. To make absolutely certain that students no longer see mathematics as an esoteric mind game, depending on memorization, but as something that makes sense and is useful in making sense of the world. Something that allows us to mathematize situations and solve problems. So the real push was in the long-term interest of students who are going to live in a world that is very different from the one I grew up in. Shopkeeper arithmetic was just fine for the world I grew up in. But even though 10 years ago we were talking about an information age, I had no idea that 10 years later, information age would have a new meaning.
So what we're really talking about is broadening what students need to learn, not doing away necessarily with what they had in the past, but really we're putting more responsibility onto the students to learn more mathematics.
More responsibility on the students to learn more mathematics, and more responsibility on teachers and school districts to make that opportunity possible. To make mathematics be something that's not seen as a subject that you fear, that you're going to go in, you're going to take time tests, you're going to spend all your time trying to memorize facts and algorithms, as opposed to time understanding, getting a sense of wonder at what things you can do with mathematics.
Could you talk a little bit about what the classroom might look like today as opposed to what most of us have as a vision of a math classroom 15 or 20 years ago?
Sure. When you change what you're going for in mathematics from something that is based on learning paper and pencil algorithmic skills, the kind of instruction that's needed has to change as well. Direct instruction, the sort of, here's an example, here are a set of problems to practice so that you can learn to do the thing I've just shown you how to do. That kind of instruction fits very well when what you are after is a development of a skill, when you don't necessarily need that person to understand what they're doing. But if you need understanding, if you're going for higher order thinking, if you're trying to help students see mathematics as something that can be used to solve problems, their engagement has to be very different. It can't be mimicking what a teacher does. There has to be intellectual engagement in problems. There has to be an attempt on the part of students to figure out what's going on, to articulate what they see in a problem situation, to collect evidence to support what they think they see, to articulate that evidence, to create mathematical arguments, and in the final analysis, working with a teacher to abstract the mathematics, because mathematics is still about generalization and abstraction. But what we are trying to do now is to help students to see, through problem situations, to see mathematics as something that comes out of real engagement with problems, mathematizing, looking at different strategies, looking for patterns, trying to find ways to represent one's thinking.
Could you talk a little bit about the perception that people have that as we create a mathematics for all students, perhaps we're not reaching our high-achieving students as well as we were in the past, and what impact that would have on high-achieving students as they prepare for traditional college entrance testing and things like that?
Sure. This is a really interesting question to me. It's one that I've wrestled with a lot. If you interview students that are in new kinds of curricula that place a great deal more emphasis on higher order thinking and problem solving, they will tell you that they have to think harder than ever before. And yet, because these curricula that go through problems, problem-centered curricula, because they give access to students at many different levels and in many different ways, parents get alarmed. They see students who have traditionally not done as well as their students that are actually able to do something within these new kind of curricula. They see students that are able to be in the same class with students for whom mathematics is much, much easier to make sense of. And yet the students that have traditionally not been very well served are doing well in these curricula. And so parents naturally say, wait a minute, maybe my student is not getting as much as they should be getting. So I think the concerns on the part of parents are absolutely to be expected and are absolutely natural that parents would be wanting the best for their children. But I would encourage them to look at what these new curricula are offering. They're offering an intellectual engagement with mathematics that is very different from what students have had an opportunity to engage in the past. Now, having said all that, one of the ingredients that is absolutely essential to make this work is that teachers that are teaching in classrooms that are problem-centered, in which there are students that are in all levels of mathematical ability, have got to remember to always be prepared, to always have in their back pocket questions to ask that will push the students that are ready for them to much deeper levels of mathematical understanding. So I've become absolutely convinced that a teacher that is in a teaching environment where they're constantly engaged in thinking about how to make this work for all students, that kind of a teacher in the classroom can push those really bright kids in ways that we've not done in the past. Now, this is a very different vision of serving the needs of these bright kids from the vision that says what we're going to do is to rush these kids as fast as we can through the standard curriculum. We can do that. You know, these kids can churn right through the standard traditional curriculum from the past. They can work through that curriculum faster than students for whom mathematics is more challenging. But the end result of that, when we get students at Michigan State University, is a real mixed bag. A colleague of mine, Elizabeth Phillips, and I have been looking at entering college freshmen at Michigan State since 1972. And we've been looking at their mathematical background and observing where they end up when they are placed into courses on our university campuses. And this is a story no matter what university you converse with. Students who are rapidly accelerated fall into two groups. There's a very small group for whom this turns out to be an opportunity to engage in higher level mathematics sooner. For the vast majority of those students, they end up disengaging from mathematics as soon as they possibly can. We have a large percentage of students, and have had over the years, in our low-level courses, our mathematics courses that don't count for anything, that in fact were placed in algebra in grade 8. So I would ask parents that are concerned to really stand back and look at what they want long-term for their students. After the middle school, there are 4 years of high school in which students can continue to be engaged in mathematics. Students coming out of that are headed for scientific careers certainly need to be pushed as far as we can push them mathematically. But my claim would be that if they're really going to be successful at becoming mathematicians and scientists, there's something more than memorized basic facts and algorithms that they need. There's something more than symbol manipulation. There's learning how to actually think mathematically, and these new curricula are trying to develop that.
Do you think that the new curricula that are out there are going to create problems as far as getting enough engineers and scientists and mathematicians?
No, I absolutely do not. I think that these new curricula are going to keep more students engaged with mathematics longer. Now, to be perfectly honest, Dan, we're in that transition period where universities are still using placement examinations that are not well aligned with what new curricula are actually doing for students. So students have strengths, mathematical strengths, that our placement examinations are not yet picking up. We've had some really interesting conversations with high school teachers and the faculty here at Michigan State, in which the high school teachers have said exactly that. They've said, our students know an awful lot of stuff that you're not even asking about. So I think we're in a time period when what school districts are going to need to do at the high school level, with whatever curricula they are using, is to look really hard at placement examinations for the kinds of universities that their students are going to be going into. They're going to have to look for places in that curricula where they can make certain that they are developing the skills that are still represented on those placement exams. And the bottom line is that the language of mathematics is algebra. Mathematics is recorded with a small set of symbols and a syntax that gives you the operating procedures on those symbols. That's still important. Developing a symbol sense, an ability to think with symbols, is all we used to try to do. Now we're trying to do that as well as develop in students a graphical sense and a sense of working with tables and other forms of representation and technology that gives us even yet another form of representation and a totally different problem-solving approach to mathematical situations. So we're trying to do more, but I think any high school has got to look at their students, look at where they are going, look at whatever curricula they choose, and look for places in that curricula, if it's not already there, that they can embed additional little side trips. There will be the opportunities in the curricula. You just have to take the opportunity to make certain that the students are prepared to leap over the hurdle that gets them into universities.
One of the questions that we're asked quite often is, what if our students are without their calculators? The implication being that our students are too calculator dependent. Could you address that? Talk about that?
I look at the work world. No one ever asks that question in the world of work. And the world of work includes being scientists and engineers. No one ever asks an engineer, what do you do if your calculator's not available? When engineers do their work, they do their work with technology. I would be, as a parent, considerably more worried if my students were coming out of high school not being so thoroughly prepared to use technology in this modern world, that if I were in a school district that was not teaching my students how to use technology in mathematics, I'd be worried. Now, the notion of being calculator dependent, all of us have got the individual horror stories that we can tell about a student who grabs a calculator to do 9 times 9. To be perfectly honest, I have found myself at my desk when I was working on something really hard, where my mind, most of my brain cells are being used to try to be clever about the mathematics. I realize that my hand is over here doing something on the calculator that my brain is completely not only capable of doing, but it's utterly trivial. So in a sense, I'm using the calculator to give more of my brain cells the capacity to think about the problem. My daughter's a high school teacher of mathematics. She teaches in one of the best high schools in the United States. If you were to choose one of the 5 top high schools, it would be on the list. It's one of the schools in the First of the World Consortium. When those students walk in the door of that high school, they get a graphing calculator in the same way they get a textbook. Those students go on to the Stanfords, the Harvards, the everywheres. In point of fact, it's one of the tools for doing mathematics. We have to learn to use it well. But to say we're not going to use calculators is sticking our head in the sand.
Dr. Lappan, you're one of the principal investigators of the Connected Math Project. In Traverse City, we've adopted that math project for our 6th, 7th, and 8th grade students. Could you just talk a little bit specifically about the Connected Math Project and your involvement in it, the research that was put into that project?
First of all, let me say that I'm not a salesperson for CMP. I would never try to talk anybody into adopting CMP. The group of authors that were involved in the development of CMP did it because we felt like it was a way that we could perhaps make a difference for students and teachers. We get no royalties from CMP. We have created a mathematics education fund on our campus into which the university puts its royalties, and the authors have signed away their royalties to the university for this math ed fund. So I want it to be absolutely clear that I'm not a salesperson. Now, I am a professional, and I will be very happy to talk to you or anyone else about the work that we did from a professional point of view. We had been working at the middle school level for a long time, as I said earlier. When the National Science Foundation indicated that it was going to fund some projects to try to play out the standards as the standards related to curriculum at all three grade spans, elementary, middle, and high school, the group of us wrote a proposal to get National Science Foundation funding to develop curricula with an eye toward realizing the standards. Now, our stance from the beginning was that you had to pay attention to both what mathematics students need to know in order to go on and be powerful in whatever is thrown at them at the high school level. But you had to also worry about teachers. So what we've done in the development of this project is work very interactively with a group of teachers that were very close to the project. We even hired teachers part of their entire academic year to come and work on the project with us. In addition, we have a large group of teachers that worked with us in the summertime. We wrote materials. We interacted with a set of trial classrooms around this country. We ended up, because there were classes in states other than the ones that we had selected at the beginning that wanted to be in on trialing the materials, we ended up with trial classrooms in 19 states. Every unit that we wrote, every grade level, was trialed for 3 full years in schools, and it was an interactive process. Teachers worked with the materials. We had an independent team of evaluators that were that had a grant from the National Science Foundation at Indiana University to track what was happening in the classrooms, to get feedback from the teachers, to interview kids, to do classroom observations, to give us as much input as was humanly possible in the development stage of the materials. We wanted to make certain that what we provided, even with the trial materials, was an excellent mathematical experience for students. When we had a version of the materials in all 3 grade levels, this was the final trial version of the materials. When we were at that stage of the game, this evaluation team worked with the balanced assessment to create a problem-solving test that covered all areas of the mathematics that we were going for. So there was an algebra strand, there was a number strand, a geometry strand, probability and statistics strand, and a measurement strand. Balanced assessment created a test that was a standards test. It wasn't a test created just to highlight CMP. Balanced assessment was an independent project that was funded by the National Science Foundation. A team of people from Balanced Assessment, Judy Zawiewski from National Louis University, Jim Ridgway from the Shell Center in Nottingham, England, and Diana Lambden from Indiana University, working with Mark Hoover, who was a graduate student that had worked at Educational Testing Service, put together the test, monitored the giving of this problem-solving test and performance task in each of the grade levels in CMP classes and in non-CMP classes. In addition, the advisory board for the Connected Math Project, which was a huge advisory board, it included parents, it included mathematicians, it included school supervisors, it included teachers. This advisory board said to us, you have to be able to report to schools and parents what students do on standardized tests that they're familiar with. So we chose the Iowa Test of Basic Skills. That project was carried out independently of the Connected Math Project and was written up independently of Connected Math. And the story is a very positive one from our perspective. At the 6th grade level and at the 7th grade level on the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, the CMP classrooms versus the non-CMP classrooms were about the same. CMP kids held their own computationally over the first couple of years. On the problem-solving test, CMP kids were on every strand significantly better than the non-CMP classrooms. And you wouldn't be surprised at this. If students are in a problem-solving environment, they're going to learn how to solve problems better. What we also noticed, and this was a surprise to us, our hope was that we wouldn't damage children in any way on the development of basic skills. We were not expecting to find that in the 8th grade, the CMP students also significantly outscored non-CMP students on the Iowa Test of Basic Skills at grade 8. And as we began to look at what was happening, when we tested the kids in the spring of the year and tested the kids again in the fall of the year, even though there's not a complete match of students, you know how it is in any of the trial sites, kids move in, kids move out. The 7th grade students, about 2/3 of them had CMP in grade 6, and the same was true for the 8th grade. The 8th grade students seem actually all the way along the line, as you move from grade 6 in the spring to grade 7 in the fall, grade 7 in the spring to grade 8 in the fall, the CMP kids seem to be losing less. Anyone who's ever looked at test scores on kids in the spring and the fall knows that what happens over the summer is really pretty devastating. We think we're teaching kids something, and then we test them again in the fall, and we think, where did it go? Well, we were finding that with a curriculum like CMP, kids were remembering more. They were carrying more with them. So we were very delighted about that. We've done a number of other research projects. One of the other projects that's at a stage in which it's written up and we've already submitted it for publication was looking at 7th and 8th graders' development of proportional reasoning skills. And again, we were very careful. We looked at proportional reasoning in every kind of incarnation. Proportional reasoning in scaling situations, proportional reasoning in number situations, proportional reasoning in ratio situations, in rate situations, and in all of those situations across the board. Connected Mathematics Project kids at grade 7 and at grade 8 outscored their counterparts in non-CMP classes by about 50%. Now, ratio and proportion is still very difficult for kids. Even the CMP kids have a way to go on getting to the point at which we'd all like to see students. But they're vastly superior in their performance to non-CMP classes on the development of ratio and proportion. It's a key concept for the development of linearity, which is a key concept for the development of algebra. So we're really pleased with what we're seeing. We're learning a lot as the materials go out to the tiers of schools that are not involved, that were not involved in our trial classes. We're finding as we work with sites around the country that those sites are finding the same sorts of results. That students in CMP classes on state test, in Texas, in Minnesota, in other sites that are working with us, kids are improving. They're improving on standardized tests as well as on problem-solving kinds of tests. So from a research perspective, we're quite pleased. We are continuing to look at other aspects. We have a research project going on at the moment. Jack Smith in the College of Education here and my colleague Elizabeth Phillips are working to better understand what students are learning about algebra from the Connected Mathematics Project. And that looks very promising indeed. We're not done with that study, but we're finding out some very interesting things about what connected math kids can do.
That's an interesting point. If we could talk just for a moment about the 8th grade CMP course in particular. As a parent looking at 8th grade CMP, it looks so different from perhaps the algebra that I would have taken in school. Could you just comment a bit on that?
One of the things that we've been trying to do with Connected Math, and I think the same is true with all of these new curriculum projects, we've been trying to look at algebra not as something that happens at a particular point in a child's life, but as something that is a strand that has to develop over time. And if you look at Connected Math as an example, we purposefully begin to deal with algebraic ideas in grade 6. You wouldn't find this out by thumbing the materials, but if you look carefully at the teachers' editions and the conversations that we're having with the teachers, we're laying the underpinnings for students being able to deal with symbolic representations of ideas, graphical representations, and tabular representations. When we move into grade 7, we have several what we think of in our mind as big algebra units in grade 7. We begin grade 7 with a unit called Variables and Patterns. Well, I don't know about your experiences, but certainly when I was going through school, it took me a very long time before anybody ever even talked to me in terms that made sense to me about this thing called a variable and its relationship to another variable in a thing called a function. We're trying in Connected Math to introduce kids to those ideas early and to use them in real situations in ways that help kids to become very, very comfortable with the notion of function and with functions represented in multiple ways. We start algebra seriously in grade 7 with 3 units, the variables and patterns, accentuate the negative, which is building another kind of number, and with a unit called Moving Straight Ahead, in which we do a development of linearity. We solve linear equations by hand in this unit in grade 7. And as we move into grade 8, of the 8 units in grade 8, I would characterize 5 of the units as algebra units. We have a unit on clever counting, which is combinatorics. We have a unit on hubcaps, kaleidoscopes, and mirrors, which is geometry. But if you look carefully at that unit, you also see symbolic representations of geometric ideas. You even see structure. Some of the understanding of the structure of algebra comes out of looking at structure in a motion sense. We look at the symmetries of triangles and symmetries of squares, and we build tables, and we look at commutativity, we look at inverses, we look at identity elements, things that are thought of and frequently developed only in algebra. We're also developing in the geometry. And in addition to that, we have 5 units that I think are really excellent algebra units to prepare all students to do very, very well at whatever they move into in the high school. Now, the question you're probably going to ask me next is, what happens to kids coming out of an 8th grade CMP? What our goal was, and it seems to be what's playing out in the sites that we have around the country, our goal was that there would be about the same proportion of students, or perhaps higher, that would be able to go into high school and start with an honors geometry and then move right into an algebra 2. That is still happening. For the rest of the students who would traditionally have gotten their first taste of algebra in a ninth grade algebra class, and many of them not do very well, our goal was for those students to have ninth grade algebra, however it's conceptualized in the high school, be something that more students would be very successful with. And I think that is also turning out to be the case. So my feeling at the moment is that the 7th and 8th grade connected math fully implemented by a teacher who's looking for every opportunity he or she can find to push on kids' understanding of algebra. Those school districts are going to find their students being able to skip an Algebra 1 in high school. If the students are lucky enough to be in a situation where there's a reform curricula also being used at the high school, that's an integrated curricula, that's doing algebra in every year of high school, along with geometry, along with probability and statistics, then there's a natural fit. It will just, a CMP middle school will simply enhance what those students are going to have as they go into high school. Even if it's a traditional high school, if the high school and the middle school talk together and work together, I think the high school teachers are going to find that CMP kids can think about mathematics in ways that students coming to them in the past have not been able to.
I just have one more question, Glenda. How do you see the NCTM standards, the curriculum standards, are about 10 years old now.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see those evolving, and if so, how?
Well, funny you should ask me that. When we did the standards in 1987, 88, and 89, took us several years to get the standards right because it was an interactive process with the field. But even as we started then, we said, you don't fix mathematics at a point in time. You continue to learn. You continue to have new technologies. You continue to have new needs. This is a modern society that we're living in. More mathematics, more different kind of mathematics is being invented all the time. So our intention was that the original standards would be continually updated. New examples that would help bring them to life would be created over time. And we're actually in the process of doing that. We started a year ago. This time, rather than producing a draft and then having a conversation about the draft, we've been engaged in a serious conversation with all the mathematics professional societies and all the membership of NCTM, a serious conversation about what have we learned from the standards? How could we write the standards documents in a way that would be even more helpful to the field? That conversation is taking place even as we speak. All around the country, at every regional meeting, we're sort of taking stock of how people use the standards, what examples do we have now that would help us to bring to life that mathematics that's in the standards. This summer, in a conference center in California, a group of writers will come together to do a reformulating. I'm searching for a word. I don't want to use the word a revision, because the central message of the standards has held up extraordinarily well. But there are some things we're smarter about. We're smarter about the kinds of misinterpretations of statements in the standards. We're also smarter about the fact that in 1989 we had a huge system that had a great deal of inertia, and we were pushing really hard to get the system started in a positive direction for children. But people interpreted that as meaning that kids don't need to be skillful anymore. They don't need to know basic facts. They don't need to be able to do anything with paper and pencil. And we never intended that. That was never, if you read the standards carefully, that was never what was said. We said things like de-emphasize, meaning you shouldn't spend all your time on this. You have to have time for high order thinking in mathematics classes. So the current effort is to articulate the growth of mathematical ideas over time in a way that will help people to understand the standards movement even better. The central message will remain. We will integrate the professional teaching standards vision with the curriculum standards so that as you are talking about what is the important mathematical content for students to know, there will be examples of how students ought to meet that content. I'm truly excited about this work because I wouldn't want anyone to think that you write at a point in time a particular set of statements and they remain the best set of statements that you can make to try to help us have a mathematical conversation that will help kids. So we're inviting everyone, parents, school boards, people across this country, as soon as this draft is out, to engage with us in a critique of the draft, a set of suggestions. We hope that schools will come up with wonderful examples of ways in which the standards-inspired curricula in standards-inspired mathematics has been helpful to kids. We also hope that school districts will point out concerns that they have. The National Council is the spokesperson for 120,000 teachers in this country, but we're a spokesperson for that group. We're not out to try to set standards that have nothing to do with where we are in this country. So we would invite the Traverse City community and all other communities to help us to make clearer what our goals are for students in this country.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. It was fun to have the conversation with you. Clearly you're asking me questions about things that I passionately believe in and have thought a lot about over time.
Well, it's kind of hard to interview you because you're so eloquent. I get wrapped up in what you're saying and kind of forget where I'm going next with it. But you're really good at this. Yeah.
Well, I had in mind that I was going to give you very short, crisp answers to all your questions, but the problem is that this is complicated, and to a certain extent, it takes some elaboration to try to help people understand how complex the issues and questions that we're facing really are.
And I think your whole demeanor is something that will be so welcomed by people. I think it would be easy to watch. I really appreciate this.
It seems hard to edit.
Yeah, I don't think I'll have to do much editing on that.
I don't think you can edit anything. You did a great job. It was
Well,
really good.
actually, I mean, you got me so wrapped up I forgot we were doing this. Oh, I just hope it's helpful. I really do.
Oh,
It will be. It will be. A
Good.
lot.
We'll send
Good.
you a copy.
And
Good, that
actually,
would be-
yeah, before we do anything with it, so that you can look at it and have your input back into it.
Right.
And we'll darken the hair and stuff that you asked us to do.
Check out all the wrinkles.